The snow outside Berlin had turned to a gray slush, the kind that clung to soldiers' boots and to the conscience of a nation unraveling. Inside a squat concrete building marked only by a small black eagle, a group of German engineers stood around a table, their breath visible in the cold. On that table rested an object that didn't belong there, a captured American sidearm, dull with mud and smoke, yet proud in its brutal geometry. The Colt M1911, its slab-sided steel frame scratched by Pacific jungles and European hedgerows alike, seemed almost alive beneath the stark light. The man in charge, Karl Reitz, picked it up carefully, as if the pistol itself might speak. Reitz was no stranger to weapons. He had helped refine the Luger's toggle lock and oversaw production trials for the Walther P-38. Precision, he often said, was a moral virtue. But this American brute, was not built for elegance. It was heavy in the hand, the trigger long and coarse, the recoil spring-wound like a coiled snake. Yet even before he fired it, Reitz sensed something uncomfortably certain. This was not a tool of ceremony or sophistication. It was a weapon of intention. The Americans had long favored force over finesse. Reports from the Russian front mentioned that their pistols could knock a man backward as if struck by a hammer. Most dismissed it as propaganda, another Allied myth. But now, holding the pistol himself, Reitz wondered. Its magazine, fat with dull brass cartridges, looked more like artillery shells than handgun ammunition. He turned one in his fingers. .45 caliber, 230 grains, subsonic but heavy enough to crush bone. The first shot broke the silence like a command from history. The muzzle flash burst white against the gray air, the recoil wrenching the pistol upward, ejecting a smoking shell that clattered across the concrete. The target, a block of pine, shuddered violently. When the smoke cleared, the hole was clean through. Behind it, another block bore a deep crater. One of the assistants whistled low. Another muttered, "Gott im Himmel." Reitz said nothing. He only reached for his clipboard, his pencil trembling slightly. They conducted further trials through the afternoon. Against sandbags, the bullets punched through two and lodged in the third. Against a pig carcass, an unflinching method of tissue testing, they created wounds so massive that even the stoic medical observer recoiled. The data was undeniable. Muzzle energy roughly 400 foot-pounds, nearly double that of their standard 9mm. A weapon that traded accuracy for sheer finality. It did not seek to wound. It sought to end. By evening, the pistol lay on a tray among a collection of foreign arms. Enfields, Smith & Wessons, a battered Thompson submachine gun. Yet the Colt seemed apart from them, exuding a quiet defiance. Reitz ran a cloth over its frame and found himself strangely respectful. There was nothing decorative about it, no flourish of pride. It was all purpose, all intent, like a soldier who no longer needed medals. He read through the accompanying American Field Manual, translated hurriedly by an interpreter. Effective range, 50 yards. Stopping power, superior. The simplicity of it irritated him. The Germans wrote manuals like theology, precise, layered, exhaustive. The Americans wrote theirs like commandments, short, absolute, final. Perhaps that was the point. Reitz jotted his findings into the day's log. High lethality, crude craftsmanship, exceptional reliability, intolerable recoil for prolonged use. But privately, in the margins, he added one more line. It is a weapon that forgives no hesitation. Outside, night crept across the proving ground. A generator hummed, casting long shadows on the walls. One of the younger engineers, barely 20, asked timidly, "Sir, why make a pistol so large, so heavy? It seems wasteful." Reitz looked at him for a moment. "Because," he said quietly, "the Americans build for fear. They remember the men who did not fall when they should have." He was referring to the stories every ordnance officer knew by heart, the Americans' experience in the Philippines 4 decades earlier. Moro insurgents, charging through gunfire with machetes, had shrugged off the smaller .38 revolvers. It took a new cartridge, the .45 ACP, to halt them in their tracks. The legend was born in blood and persistence, not design. The Germans, who revered precision, had chosen efficiency. The Americans, who valued survival, had chosen certainty. The tests continued the next day, now under more controlled conditions. Pressure sensors, chronographs, impact meters. Each confirmed the same truth. The M1911 hit harder, stayed cleaner, and functioned even when fouled by mud. In their language of numbers and physics, the German engineers found something uncomfortable, a proof of philosophy. Power had a logic of its own. During a break, Wright sat at his desk, studying a photograph taken from the pistol's captured owner, a young American lieutenant smiling awkwardly beside a jeep. On the back, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Come home safe." The image unsettled him. Somewhere, a family waited for this man who would never return, his pistol now dissected by the enemy. War turned everything sacred into data. Late in the evening, as the engineers prepared to leave, Wright stayed behind. He picked up the Colt once more, loaded a single round, and fired at the steel backstop. The sound rolled through the chamber like thunder. When the echo died, he whispered to himself, "Stopping power indeed." He wasn't sure whether it was admiration or fear that stirred in him. The following morning, the official report was typed and sealed. It carried his signature and a classified stamp. Result: extraordinary. Not reproducible. The weapon would be stored for further analysis, but the findings were already circulating quietly among senior officers. Some mocked the Americans for overcompensation. Others, especially those who had seen the front lines, took notice. In a war increasingly fought by machines, the Colt represented something primitive yet enduring, a reminder that violence, at its core, was still human. It was forged not for mass fire but for moments when one life confronted another. That intimacy of purpose disturbed Wright more than any statistic. As he locked the lab and stepped into the night air, the distant drone of Allied bombers rolled overhead. The earth trembled. Somewhere beyond the clouds, American pilots, perhaps carrying the same pistol in their holsters, were rewriting the map of Europe. Wright watched the sky flare with orange and muttered, "So this is what power feels like when it looks back." Weeks later, fragments of the report would reach Berlin's higher command. A colonel, reading it aloud to his aides, laughed and said, "Imagine if they built rifles that hit like this." The room chuckled, but the colonel's eyes betrayed unease. There was a recognition buried in the humor, that the enemy's strength was not in numbers or machines but in conviction, an unshakable faith that when they fired, they meant it. And as winter thickened and the Reich began to crack under the pressure of two fronts, the Colt M1911 sat in its steel cabinet, oiled and silent, its legend already spreading through whispers and reports. Some said it was overbuilt. Others called it barbaric. But one phrase appeared again and again in the margins of the engineers' notes: "Unlike anything we have ever seen." What they did not yet know was that their fascination would outlive them. The pistol they studied in secret would soon be firing back at them, in the hands of men who believed in it completely. And belief, history would prove, is the deadliest caliber of all. The convoy reached the proving grounds before dawn. Frost shimmered on the barbed wire, and the air smelled of iron, oil, and fear, the peculiar scent of a nation that had begun to test its own desperation. Beyond the checkpoint, low buildings crouched against the cold, their chimneys breathing thin smoke. The Reich's secret weapons office. Inside, the war was studied like a disease under glass. Karl Wright stepped down from the truck, rubbing warmth into his gloved hands. Behind him, a handful of engineers followed, hauling crates stamped with black eagles and captured Allied markings. Among them lay the pistol he could not stop thinking about, the Colt M1911. Its very presence in this place seemed an act of defiance, a whisper from across the Atlantic reminding them that the enemy's ingenuity was as lethal as his courage. Wright walked briskly toward the main testing hall, its walls trembling faintly from distant artillery practice. Every sound of gunfire now felt closer, as if the front itself were advancing through their laboratories. Inside, floodlights hung from girders, illuminating a scene both clinical and cruel. Sandbags formed barriers around a long concrete tunnel lined with steel target. Tables bore fragments of weapons disassembled to their last pins. Young technicians, pale from lack of sleep, adjusted chronographs and pressure gauges. The hum of generators mixed with the rhythmic clatter of typewriters. Each keystroke, Wright's thought, was another small act of denial, numbers in place of chaos. He opened the crate with a crowbar. The Colt lay within, wrapped in a torn American flag used for transport. For a moment no one spoke. One assistant reached to move it aside, but Wright stopped him. "Leave it," he said quietly. The pistol came with its own shroud. He lifted the weapon, its weight oddly reassuring. It was not elegant, but it had survived. He had begun to wonder if that alone explained why the Americans were winning. The first series of tests began with ballistic gelatin, translucent blocks meant to mimic human tissue. Each was weighed and measured with cold precision. Wright loaded the Colt himself, feeling the stubborn resistance of the magazine's spring. The sound of the slide chambering around echoed through the hall like a blade drawn from a sheath. He raised the weapon, exhaled, and fired. The shot cracked the air. The recoil jolted his arm. When the smoke cleared, the gelatin had burst open along a deep wound channel, torn and radiating fissures like shattered glass. The technicians murmured among themselves. The Luger and Walther tests had produced neat tunnels, efficient, predictable. But this was carnage captured in motion. Wright scribbled notes without looking up. Significant hydrostatic displacement. Massive transfer of energy. Instant incapacitation probable. Then he underlined a word twice: fear. He had not expected to feel it here, in a place built to control every variable. For comparison, they repeated the trial with the standard 9mm Luger. The bullet punched a narrow hole, stopping in the second block. The Colt's round had exited the third entirely. The data was irrefutable, yet Wright felt no triumph in the discovery. Power like this did not serve reason, it served will. During the midday pause, the men gathered in the mess hall, a dim room smelling of cabbage and cordite. A radio in the corner sputtered news from the Eastern Front, another city lost, another retreat disguised as a tactical adjustment. One engineer, a young Bavarian named Hess, joked bitterly that if every German soldier carried an M1911, the war might be over by Christmas. The others laughed, but the laughter had an edge to it, an admission wrapped in humor. Wright stirred his coffee and said nothing. He knew better than to envy the enemy's weapons. Envy led to disloyalty. Yet beneath his silence, curiosity burned. After lunch, they resumed with new experiments. Heavy clothing layers, leather belts, and even horsehide to simulate battlefield gear. Each shot told the same story. The .45 slug cut through resistance with terrifying simplicity. When they retrieved the deformed bullets, their copper jackets peeled like flower petals, every fold testifying to violence perfected by physics. One technician crossed himself. Wright pretended not to notice. By late afternoon, the tests grew darker. They dragged out pig carcasses preserved from nearby farms, standard wartime practice for wound analysis. The hall filled with the dull thump of impact, the splatter of tissue, the metallic ring of expended casings. One assistant, pale and shaking, left the room midway through. Wright remained jaw tight. He recorded the results. Permanent cavity, catastrophic. Comparative lethality exceeds control by ratio of 1.9 to 1. The numbers were meaningless against what he had seen, yet he wrote them because he must. In war, truth was not measured in morality but in metric. At dusk, the Reich's chief ordnance officer, Oberst Friedrich Kranz, arrived unannounced. His uniform was immaculate, his manner clipped. He examined the bullet holes without expression. "So," he said finally, "the Americans rely on brute force, as expected." Wright hesitated. "Yes, Herr Oberst, But brute force, it seems, works. Kranz's eyes flickered, then narrowed. Record your admiration carefully, he writes. The Führer prefers respect to be one-sided. He turned on his heel and left, leaving the warning hanging like smoke. The silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Reitz resumed his notes, though his hand shook slightly. He realized that science had boundaries now, political ones. Knowledge itself had become treason if it praised the wrong side. Yet he could not unsee what he had seen. Somewhere deep down, he felt a strange gratitude toward the weapon for reminding him that truth still existed, even in a war built on lies. That night, alone in his office, he opened the day's report. The numbers were impressive, but they meant little without context. So he added an unapproved appendix, his own thoughts, hidden among the technical jargon. Enemy pistol demonstrates extreme reliability. Mechanically simple, functionally pure. Its design implies faith in the user, not bureaucracy. German models prioritize control. American design prioritizes trust. He stared at those words for a long time, then tore the page out and hid it beneath a stack of blueprints. Outside, snow began to fall again, softening the roar of distant artillery. Wright stepped onto the balcony overlooking the test range. The landscape lay ghostly under the floodlights, pocked with bullet scars. He imagined an American soldier somewhere in Italy or France, holding the same weapon, steady hands guided not by orders but by instinct. A man who believed his pistol would work every time, no matter the mud, the cold, or the chaos. Reitz envied that certainty. In his world, nothing worked as it should anymore. Not the weapons, not the war, not the truth. The generator hummed to life again, and somewhere in the dark, a final shot echoed, another test by one of his subordinates. The sound rolled across the compound like distant thunder. Reitz closed his eyes. He could almost feel the recoil in his arm again, the surge of power that had unsettled him so deeply. Perhaps that was why the Colt unnerved the Reich's engineers. It carried within its recoil a philosophy they could not imitate, one that valued decisiveness over doctrine. When he turned to leave, he noticed the captured pistol resting under a lamp, gleaming faintly in the half-light. For a moment, he imagined it breathing, waiting. He whispered to it as if confessing to an adversary, "You are not the strongest weapon, but you may be the most honest." The snow kept falling. Somewhere beyond those walls, the war was changing shape. Soon, the Americans would cross the Rhine, bringing with them thousands more of these steel truths. And in the files of Kummersdorf, buried beneath layers of secrecy and pride, lay a simple sentence typed by Reitz himself, unparalleled effect. He didn't yet know how prophetic those words would be. The sun hung low over Camp Perry, Ohio, casting long shadows across a field of khaki and gun smoke. Rows of American recruits stood stiff in formation, their breaths fogging in the early chill, the sound of boots crunching against frostbitten gravel. A grizzled sergeant barked commands, his voice more gravel than man, as the recruits drew their sidearms. To a foreign observer, the Colt M1911 might have looked ungainly, its slide square, its recoil fierce. But in the hands of these boys, farmers, factory workers, sons of mechanics, it became an equalizer. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head, the sergeant growled. Because hesitation's what gets you buried. The line erupted in thunder. Each .45 slug punched into paper silhouettes 20 yards downrange, tearing ragged holes through the torsos. The smell of gunpowder mixed with sweat and oil. To these men, the pistol was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy carved in steel, a statement that when pushed to the wall, America did not aim to impress. It aimed to end the threat. The Colt M1911 was not graceful, but it was honest. That honesty was born not in laboratories but in jungle mud decades earlier. In the Philippines at the turn of the century, the U.S. military had learned a brutal lesson. Moro warriors, their bodies wrapped in ritual bindings and faith, charged through revolver fire like ghosts. The smaller .38 caliber bullets barely slowed them. Soldiers reported men struck multiple times who still reached the trenches, swinging machetes until the fight was hand-to-hand. In desperation, the Americans revived old .45 revolvers from storage, heavy, slow, but devastating. The attacks stopped. That single, terrible truth shaped a doctrine: never let an enemy get back up. By 1911, John Moses Browning had turned that doctrine into design. In his workshop, among blueprints and smoke, he conceived a pistol that harnessed raw recoil without apology. Short recoil operation, locked breech, 7 rounds of .45 automatic Colt pistol ammunition, enough to stop anything that moved toward you with intent. The Army accepted it as if recognizing an inevitable truth, and when the Great War erupted, American soldiers carried it into the trenches of France, where mud swallowed boots and men prayed for reliability. Letters from the front called it the last word in persuasion. 3 decades later, that same pistol was in the hands of GIs from North Africa to the Solomon Islands. A corporal named Evans wrote home after the Battle of Tarawa, "The Colt is ugly, but she's loyal. When the rifle jammed, she spoke." Another Marine said, "You feel like you're holding justice in your hand." To them, it wasn't myth. It was survival. The .45 didn't care about armor, distance, or wind. It cared about ending the immediate danger so the man holding it could see another sunrise. In contrast, the Germans built for precision. The Luger was a craftsman's pistol, delicate and balanced like a pocket watch. Its toggled mechanism was beautiful but sensitive to dirt, to mud, to the unpredictable chaos of war. The Americans didn't build for beauty, they built for certainty. Their pistol could be buried, kicked, soaked, and still fire. If the Luger represented control, the Colt represented conviction. One engineer later said, "It's the difference between asking permission to win and demanding it." At a training ground near Fort Benning, Lieutenant Thomas Reed watched his recruits practice reload drills. They were raw boys, some barely 18. He had carried his own M1911 through North Africa, through Kasserine Pass, where he'd seen men die for lack of readiness. "This thing," he told them, holding the pistol high, "isn't made for distance. It's made for when the world gets close and ugly. When you can smell the other man's breath." He paused, scanning their nervous faces. "And when that moment comes, you won't have time to think. The gun will do the thinking for you. That's why we trust it." The philosophy of power wasn't written in book. It was taught in sweat and instinct. American doctrine accepted chaos, embraced imperfection, and compensated with overwhelming will. On the battlefield, that meant improvisation. GIs used wire, tape, and even shoelaces to keep their weapons firing. The Colt, forgiving as it was, became their constant companion. Veterans joked it kicked like a mule, but no one ever complained about what it did when it hit. Back across the Atlantic, German intelligence officers compiled field reports from Normandy and Italy. Among the captured correspondence was one particularly telling line from a Wehrmacht soldier: "Their pistol leaves wounds you do not survive." It was said with a mixture of respect and fear. The myth of the .45 began to spread, an unintentional form of psychological warfare. Even before the Americans arrived, the rumor of their sidearm preceded them, whispered in foxholes as a warning: "The one who carries the Colt does not miss twice." The contrast between the two philosophies mirrored the contrast between the nations themselves. The Reich built monuments, America built machines. One sought immortality through perfection, the other through endurance. In the end, endurance won. By 1944, production lines across the United States churned out M1911s by the million, 1.9 million before war's end. They rolled off factory floors in Hartford and Ithaca, in Remington plants and Singer sewing machine factories. Every pistol identical, every piece interchangeable. In a world at war, unity itself became a weapon. A journalist visiting the assembly line noted the quiet determination of the workers: women with rolled sleeves, men with missing sons, each tightening a screw or testing a spring. Every trigger pulled here, one foreman said, saves a boy out there. The camera lingered on a finished pistol stamped U.S. property. It gleamed under the fluorescent light like a promise. For the Americans, the Colt represented something elemental, that technology should serve the man, not the other way around. In foxholes, pilots' holsters, tank crews' belts, it was the last argument of democracy. There were stories, some verified, others legend, of soldiers taking out charging foes at point-blank range, of downed pilots keeping one bullet for themselves rather than be captured. The Colt was not gentle, but it was loyal. It did what was asked and nothing more. Lieutenant Reed would later write in his field journal during the advance on Sicily, "When everything else falls apart, this pistol reminds you that power isn't size, it's certainty. It's the belief that the next shot will count." That belief, he thought, was the true weapon the Germans couldn't replicate. You could copy steel. You couldn't copy faith. By winter of 1944, captured German officers began filing reports of unusual American handguns of great stopping effect. Some had even taken them into their own use, scavenging from fallen GIs, unwilling to part with what they secretly called the Thunder pistol. Somewhere deep in Kummersdorf, those same engineers, Wrights among them, were reading those reports with grim recognition. The data they had written in secrecy had now returned to them as blood-soaked proof. The Colt M1911 had crossed oceans, languages, and ideologies, carrying with it the essence of a nation, not polished, not perfect, but unstoppable when it mattered most. Its philosophy was simple: power without pretense. A pistol not for intimidation, but for assurance. And as the Americans prepared to push across the Rhine, that philosophy would meet its final test, not in laboratories or manuals, but in the trembling hands of men who believed that conviction could be engineered into steel. The winter of 1945 fell like a long exhale over Germany. Villages burned low and quiet, the snow above them gray with soot, and the air hummed with the sound of engines that did not belong to the Reich. The war had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Inside the ruins of Kummersdorf, Karl Reitz moved through the empty testing hall, boots echoing against cracked concrete. The machinery was silent now. The reports were filed, the numbers sent, the conclusions ignored. The pistol, the American one, remained locked away, oiled and waiting. He ran his hand along the cabinet as if greeting an old adversary. "You've outlived your judges," he murmured. Across the river, the front drew closer. Columns of retreating Wehrmacht soldiers trudged through snow-choked roads, rifles slung low, eyes hollow. Among them, a few carried captured sidearms, spoils of desperation. Some were Lugers, others the American .45. They called it the Thunder pistol. It had become rumor and relic in equal measure. Men who'd fired it swore it hit harder than reason, louder than doubt. Even the cynics, those who no longer believed in anything, felt something when they held it. Power, perhaps, or memory. Reitz had stayed behind to destroy records before the Allies arrived. Officially, he was ensuring no secrets fell into enemy hands. Privately, he was protecting truth. The Reich had ordered its findings dismissed as irrelevant to German design philosophy. Yet the weapon had already spoken louder than any philosophy could. That night, Allied artillery began to pound the outskirts. Windows shattered, the earth quaked. Reitz packed the pistol into a satchel. It wasn't loyalty that drove him, it was curiosity. He wanted to see what it meant to wield what he had studied. He joined a convoy of retreating soldiers heading west. They drove through forests illuminated by distant fire, headlights dimmed to slivers. The men around him were silent, their faith worn thin as their boots. By dawn, they reached a crossroads littered with burned-out trucks. Smoke drifted from a farmhouse at the bend. Someone shouted, American voices, and bullets tore through the snow. Chaos erupted. Reitz dove behind a stone wall, heart hammering. The Germans fired sporadically, panic more than tactics. The smell of cordite and pine filled the air. Through the haze, he saw a young GI advancing, helmet low, rifle ready, every movement confident. For a moment, Wrights understood what his reports had failed to capture. This wasn't about superiority. It was belief, solid as the steel in that man's hands. The German beside him fired his Mauser. It jammed. Another fell back, clutching his stomach. Wrights reached into his satchel and drew the Colt. It felt impossibly alive, warm even in the cold. He aimed without thought and fired once. The pistol roared, a deep, visceral sound unlike the sharp crack of a Luger. The recoil slammed through his palm, familiar yet foreign. The American fell, his rifle spinning into the snow. Silence followed, thick and terrible. Wright stared at the pistol, smoke curling from its barrel. In that instant, he felt no victory, only revelation. The weapon was not a machine, it was a mirror. It gave back exactly what the hand behind it believed. For the Americans, conviction. For him, emptiness. He dropped it into the snow, unable to bear its weight. The skirmish ended within minutes. The surviving Germans scattered. Wrights walked north alone, the satchel empty but the sound of that shot echoing in his ears. He crossed frozen fields where tanks lay half-buried and unrecognizable. The war was ending, but not cleanly. It faded like a nightmare that refused to be forgotten. In April, American troops reached Kummersdorf. Among the debris they found crates of prototype weapons and, tucked away in a steel drawer, another Colt M1911, its serial number traced to a captured officer from the 101st Airborne. A young American ordnance lieutenant examined it, turned to his superior, and smiled. "She's home," he said softly. The irony was lost on no one. The weapon had come full circle. In the following months, Allied investigators sifted through mountains of paperwork. They found fragments of Wrights's reports, the notes detailing ballistic superiority, the phrase unparalleled effect. Copies were sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where U.S. engineers chuckled over German astonishment. One margin note in English read, "They finally admit it." Yet beneath the humor lingered respect. Even the victors recognized the rare honesty of a defeated scientist's words. Meanwhile, on the front lines of occupied Germany, a handful of American soldiers carried captured Lugers as trophies. But others, those who'd found the .45 in enemy holsters, reacted differently. "Strange," one sergeant wrote home, "seeing them use our own iron. Feels like they're borrowing our language." The Colt had transcended sides. It had become a dialect of power understood universally. Back in the ruins of Kassel, Wright survived by repairing farm tools for villagers. He kept no insignia, no medals, no allegiance. Sometimes at night, he dreamed of the proving ground, of the echo of that pistol in the concrete chamber, the flash of fire in the dark. He woke always with the same thought: some truths are louder than flags. He never saw another M1911 again, but he knew they were out there, reshaping battlefields he would never walk. Across the ocean, the pistol became myth. Marines swore it could stop a charging enemy with one round. Pilots carried it as insurance against capture. Even decades later, in Korea and Vietnam, the .45 sound was still described as thunder rolling through valleys. To carry one was to inherit a lineage of certainty. Engineers improved its grip, polished its sights, modernized its materials, but its soul remained untouched. The German reports, once buried in archives, were declassified years later. Historians read them with disbelief, testimonies of grudging admiration from a nation that had prided itself on mechanical supremacy. One passage, translated from Wrights's handwriting, stood out. "The weapon's power is not mechanical. It is psychological. It persuades both shooter and target of its inevitability." Scholars called it poetic. Soldiers simply called it true. By the late 20th century, the M1911 was no longer just a sidearm. It was an artifact of philosophy. It appeared in the hands of generals, lawmen, even civilians who sought something unchanging in an age of technology. Its simple mechanics defied obsolescence. The world moved toward lighter calibers, faster rounds, higher capacities, but the .45 remained, slow and heavy, whispering from history that not all progress is improvement. And so, in the balance between precision and conviction, between engineering and belief, the Colt endured. It carried within it the memory of every man who had trusted it, American or German, believer or skeptic. Each trigger pull was an echo of the same ancient truth, that in the chaos of war, certainty is the rarest weapon of all. On a quiet spring evening, long after the surrender, Wright stood in a field outside Castle, watching children chase the last light of day. He thought of how the sound of that pistol had once terrified him, and how now, in memory, it felt almost like absolution. He smiled faintly and whispered into the breeze, "Perhaps it wasn't their weapon we feared, but their faith in it." Far away, in an American museum, one of the pistols from Kummersdorf rested in a glass case. Its plaque read simply, "Captured 1943. Tested by the enemy. Respected forever." Visitors walked past, unaware that in that silent piece of steel lived the confession of a war's proudest engineers, that they had met something they could not surpass. History would call it the Colt M1911. The men who saw it work called it something simpler. They called it proof.